So hi everyone, welcome once again to the first ever workshop that we'll be doing. This is the first of a series of 10 different workshops that we'll be hosting as hosts in the spirit of promoting development for future debaters out there. All of these workshops are free. In order to see what the other 9 workshops are, you can go to our website on worlds.org, go to the store. It's also on all our Facebook page and social media. Click on the link. All of them are free to get the link to join the groups and then get access to our future workshops. All right, so without further ado, I will pass it to the facilitator, Ernest.
Hello, hi. Just confirming if you guys can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, cool. I'll be sharing my screen. All right, I hope you guys can see this. Okay.
Yep, we can.
All right, so hi everyone. Welcome to this first workshop leading up to Malaysia Nationals in November. So I'm very excited to kick things off with this introductory workshop about arguments and responses, basically just letting you guys know the structure that often judges value when it comes to assessing argumentations and responses. And I think I just want to make a quick note, like 2 notes, I would say. Firstly, like I said, this is a bit of an introductory workshop for people who are just starting out with debating, those who wish to venture into debating. But secondly, I think the great thing about this is that this is also transferable to other facets of your life. Things like whenever you're trying to make a presentation, for instance, or even an essay writing, for instance. I think the beauty of debating is that because you're so trained to adhere to a set of structure when it comes to making argumentations and making statements, that bodes very well when it comes to in other facets of life when you're asked to make argumentations or make presentations and statements. It helps a lot with this structure in mind, and being able to formulate your statements in a way that is most persuasive, and just achieves whatever purpose you intend to achieve. So I think this is also good for other facets of life other than just debating. So I hope you guys find this workshop meaningful and beneficial. So let's get things started. Right. So this is just me. I've been debating for quite some time, and just yesterday, in fact, the host TJ and we were judging at UADC, United Asians Debating Championship, and we were happy to be able to break. So we'll be judging next weekend in the out rounds. But yeah, I've been debating for quite some time. I don't see myself as an amazing debater. I have always had to work really, really hard. So I understand the struggles of maybe some of you guys who feel that you guys don't have the quote unquote talent when it comes to debating, but I think just being able to be disciplined and follow a set of structures, and just following the structure that I have in place for you guys, I think it would help a lot with ensuring that you guys are able to become better and better, not just in debating, but just in speaking in general and making presentations. Right. So my learning objectives for you guys are very simple in this workshop. I think just firstly, I hope you guys understand structures to an argument. Secondly, hopefully with that structure, you're able to make structured arguments. And I think structured arguments are more often than not more compelling, because once you know the structures to a typical argumentation, then you are sort of obligated to fill in the gaps and ensure that you cover all the bases, which therefore makes for a more compelling argumentation. And I think that is how you get to become a better debater and a better speaker on that front. And finally, just a bit of responses as well. Because in debating, you will have to rebut arguments and respond to POIs, for instance. I'll also be touching a bit on responses and POIs in general, and how you should go about responding to arguments. So these 3 are things that I hope you guys can take away from this workshop. Let's get things started. So my lecture overview is very simple. I'll first talk about the 3 M's, just a bit of a preemption and a bit of an introduction as to how judges see debates as a whole. And then secondly would be the meat of this workshop with regards to argumentation, specifically the structure that is very much pervasive within all argumentations and debates, how to construct them. And then I think if we have time, we can also try out a motion. We'll just take a motion from UADC. I think that is a perfect example. And then finally, just a bit of responses and rebuttals if we have time. Just hopefully you guys are able to, make strategic responses to other people's argumentations for Piran. Yep, so let's get things started with the first part on the 3Ms. I think you guys know what the 3Ms are. Or if you don't know, it's very straightforward. It's meta, method, and manner. So I would say that this workshop, this introductory workshop, would cover the first two parts on meta and method, because a lot of times when it comes to structuring our argumentation, firstly, if you're able to structure everything in a way that is cohesive and compelling, then that is method accounted for already. And also because you're following this set of structure, this also means that you have to cover all bases from your idea to your process analysis to the final grounding, the conclusive part of your argumentation. All of those things constitute meta. So I would say that this workshop would cover the first two parts of the M. Manner is very stylistic. It really depends on the way you speak. Your personal style when it comes to speaking and making speeches. So that is not the important part of this workshop. It's mostly just ensuring that you guys have the meta and the method down. All right. So yeah, meta is the meat of the debate. It's what you say basically. So in debate, we try not to limit, we try not to divide between arguments, rebuttals, responses. Like when you make a debate speech, sure, you would structure these things and have a segment for rebuttals and then move on to your argumentations, for instance. But when we judge debates, we don't try to sort of point out, oh, this is an argument, this is a rebuttal, because we think every single statement that you make, if it's helpful towards your case, then surely that would constitute as a constructive thing for your case that would help your team win the debate. So anything that is remotely positively helpful for your case in general, that will constitute meta. So the essential components are basically the idea, which is what are you trying to propose, what are you trying to prove, and that is followed with the analysis, which is the logic, the process, the evidence, and finally the relevance and the importance of your content. Why is it that what I'm saying matters in this debate? Why is it so important that the judge has to prioritize what you say? So just a bit of foreshadowing. This is already the structure of the argumentation. We'll go obviously a lot more in depth later, but just having this idea in mind, having this structure in mind, from idea to analysis to the relevance and importance, I think that you're pretty much set to go when it comes to your structure and your argumentations. It's just ensuring that you fill all the bases within this structure that ensures that you have good matter in any debate round. On method, it's basically how you say things, how you present an argumentation, and this is largely pertaining to structure. So if you're able to follow structure, if you're able to follow a set of structure that is compelling and ensures that you're able to cover all bases within an argumentation, then that is method that is good for you already. Obviously, structures differ according to your roles. So the first and second speaker, you guys will obviously follow, signposting, labeling your argument, and then structuring your analysis. For whip speeches, it's about summarizing the debate. So that is another issue entirely, another workshop entirely on whip speeches. I think Hannah will be doing that later on. So maybe just look up for that. Also, just in addition to structure, obviously ensuring that you give priority to the most important issues within the debate. That's also part of method, ensuring that you prioritize the most important arguments and you don't focus entirely on like framing or responses only, but also ensuring that you have enough time to give all your argumentations and just responsiveness in general, whether or not you're able to engage with your opponent's arguments and tackle them and make them lose, for instance. Yeah, so that's method accounted for. And finally, manner, it's how you say things to persuade people. This is more so your volume, for instance, your tone, clarity, pace, injecting humor or sarcasm. All of these things will constitute manner. So This is less part of today's workshop. It's more on it's more on method and meta. But manner is also something that you guys can brush up on with more practice and more tournament experience, for instance. So yeah, that is the 3 M's accounted for. Let's move on to the actual meat of today's workshop, which is argumentation. So I think the misconception when it comes to making arguments is that once prep time has started, you would always just go straight to argumentation. You would always try and like scramble and ask your teammate, hey, what is it that I should argue for? What is it that we should talk about? And I think that is a bit of a directionless prep, which is not very strategic. Oftentimes, before you even think about argumentations, you want to identify a few things. I think these few things are very crucial in ensuring that you have a clear direction as to what the debate is about, and you know what you're setting out to do as either gov or opposition. And if you're able to identify all of these elements, I think that provides a great stepping stone for you to be able to have better discussions and more robust analysis when it comes to your subsequent argumentations within a particular case. So I would perhaps a great analogy would be like all of your meta, all of your argumentations would be your meat, for instance. I would perhaps say that all of these things like status quo problems, all of these things are like the plate used to, carry that meat. And if you don't have a solid plate or a solid foundation to hold that meat, then it's likely going to crumble. You're not going to be able to like serve that meat towards the judges. So I would say that these things are also really, really crucial. And I would say people should try to prioritize discussing about these things first before you move into argumentations. So what are some of these elements I talk about here? So firstly, identifying status quo. Status quo basically means the world as it is right now. What is up with the world? What is happening within society today? Some occurrences that are happening, be it world events, societal events, global affairs, or even just general trends, for instance. Anything that is happening right now would be considered status quo. Oftentimes, when a debate motion is being set, it sort of implies that there's something wrong with status quo, and it falls on the burden of the government bench to propose something to solve this problem. So with this identification of the status quo comes with the identification of the problems that come from status quo. So these problems are obviously really important because you're proposing something to like solve these problems within the status quo. So a sample motion, for instance, if we talk about this house believes that universities should abolish examinations. Perhaps your status quo would be that right now students have a lot of subjects they have to deal with. Students have a lot of examinations to tend to, a lot of assessments, and that's the first status quo, for instance. And then secondly, perhaps there's a lot of pressure from parents or scholarship organizations or your lecturers, for instance. So all of these things are perhaps your status quo, things that are happening right now when it comes to students being burdened by too many examinations. So the next step would be to just talk about problems. What are some of the problems with this? I think firstly, you can maybe just think of how this means that students are under so much pressure all the time to always keep up with grades, study. And once you study way too much, that means that your social life within the university suffers as well. You're less able to partake in, say, for instance, co-curricular activities, be in clubs, for instance, societies to like pick up leadership skills, for instance, pick up certain skill sets. So all of these things suffer. So these are the problems that could be attributed to the status quo. So if you see what I'm doing here, I'm outlining some of the general trends that are happening within society or within universities in general. That is status quo. Once you're able to identify status quo, then comes a slew of problems that you can perhaps envision or conceptualize. Those are the problems that you would want to overcome with the motion itself. So that is status quo and problems done. After that, maybe just talk a bit more about your stance within that particular topic. So for instance, when it comes to the same motion just now, this house believes that universities should abolish examinations. Why is it that you want to abolish examinations? Perhaps the central stance or what you really believe in is you want students to be able to have the best possible university experience or the best possible university life within that 4-year period in university. So that is the stance. You believe that students should have the best possible university life. And yeah, that is the stance of your team when it comes to that motion. So if you're able to establish that stance, I think that also sets you up very nicely in terms of how you forward your case later on in the subsequent speeches and in your subsequent points of argumentations. Finally, just illustrating mechanism. So perhaps in a policy debate, perhaps like this house would abolish examinations, for instance. So how would you go about doing it? Perhaps you would say, firstly, obviously you would abolish all examinations. There's no such thing as examinations as a whole. What would you substitute that examinations with? Perhaps it will be more like more holistic forms of assessments, things like pop quizzes or side projects for students to work on, practicals, like different forms of assessments to replace examinations to determine whether or not the student has fulfilled the learning outcomes of the particular subject. So that is your mechanism. All of these things are really important because if you don't have these things within your setup of the debate, then I'm not sure what your argument will seek to prove. The judges will not know why is it that you want to propose these argumentations. And perhaps you would slide all of these things in within your argumentations, which is fine. But I think if you're able to just have a very clear picture from the very beginning, what is status quo, what are problems that are associated with that status quo, and then illustrate your stance and the mechanisms to solve those problems, I think that is a very good foundation for you to be able to forward arguments in a more compelling manner because the judges know what problems you're trying to solve. They know what your stance is. They know what your mechanism is. I think that is a very good stepping stone for you to be able to forward your argumentations better in any debate round in general. So yeah, just summarizing this part, identify the status quo, things that are happening within society today, within any particular context, the problems that happen with that status quo, and why is it that they're so bad, and then illustrating your stance, what is it that you truly believe in within this debate, and finally showing the mechanism, the way in which you solve that problem, be outlining a policy, for instance, any mechanisms that would sort of overcome all of the problems that you talk about with status quo. So by the way, if you guys have any other questions, feel free to just type them out in chat for me. I'll tend to it later after I conclude this section. But yeah, it's fine. I welcome any and all questions. This is supposed to be a discussion anyway, so that you guys learn better and understand better, and we can have a discussion about things that you should do in a debate or you should not do in a debate. But yeah, let's just move on. Right, this is the argumentation framework. Obviously, it's a lot more robust than this, beyond just idea analysis and conclusion. But I think if teams are able to adhere to this large structure as a whole, then you're able to firstly make structured argumentation, secondly, make the argumentation more compelling, which therefore increases your likelihood of persuading the judge to give you the win in this debate. So I always tell my juniors that I coach back in university that just follow the structure, the idea, the analysis, and then the conclusion, right? So do that for every single argumentation. I think that would help with regards to ensuring that you have everything you need within that argument to persuade the judges to give you guys the win. So let's first start with the first part, the idea. Obviously, that's the very first thing that you should do within your when making an argument. What do I mean by this? When you make an argumentation, you want to first flag out what that argument is. So this essentially means the very first thing that you have to do is to label your argument. Let the judge know what the next 2 or 3 minutes that you're talking about is going to be. So for instance, maybe just talk in the motion, this house would abolish examinations in universities. Perhaps your first argument is about, why is it okay for us to abolish examinations? And then the second argument is, how is it that you get better quality university life, or how is it that you improve the university experience of students? Regardless, I think it is important for debaters and speakers in general to just label your arguments at the very beginning of your speech. The reason for this, like I said, is you want the judges to know what you're speaking about. You don't want the judge to just listen to you and figure out what you're going to say. You want the judge to know preemptively what you're going to say for the next 2 or 3 minutes. It sort of keeps them more awake either when it comes to like noting down your statements, tracking your arguments. All of these things are really important, and they can only happen if you explicitly label your arguments from the very beginning. So the question is, how do you do it? How do you label your argumentations? You can do it via 2 methods. Number one, you can do it via statements or via questions. So the first method, which is via statements, you can just say, my first point is, abolishing examinations is principally justified. Or you can say, abolishing examinations will improve the university experience of these students. So once you're able to say this from the very beginning of your speech, or from the very, sorry, not your speech, your argumentation, then the judge the judge will know, oh, okay, your next 2 minutes or 3 minutes will be talking about principle. Why is it so bad that we subject students to a horrible method of assessing them through examinations? Or is it that, oh, okay, the next 2 or 3 minutes, you're going to talk about how is it that you improve the university experience of these students? Why is it so important? So those things will float within the minds of the judge once you're able to label the arguments. You can also do this via questions. I think the question form is perhaps the more preferred method by a lot of debaters today, I would say. So it could be along the lines of, why is it principally justified for us to abolish examinations? And secondly, how does this improve the university experience of these students? Maybe like, debaters prefer this method because by asking a question, your next 2 or 3 minutes of statements will seek to answer that question. So for instance, if you're trying to answer how will abolishing examinations improve the university experience of the students, your next 2 to 3 minutes when it comes to like running through all of your ideas, all of your process analysis, all of these things will seek to answer those questions, right? So it's a bit of a rhetorical strategy that debaters use sometimes, but either way, make sure you just flag out your argumentations, label your arguments so that people know what you're talking about. That is via statements or via questions. Any method is fine. Just make sure you let the judge know what is it that you want to talk about for the next 2 or 3 minutes in a speech. Okay, so brainstorming ideas. I would say that this happens during prep time, obviously, but also happens when you're listening to your opponent speak in a debate round. Brainstorming ideas essentially means after you've set out the status quo, the problems, and your policy, for instance, your mechanisms, the next would be to consider what are some of the aspects that you want to talk about as to why is it that we should do a particular thing, or why is it that we should not do a particular thing. And the go-to structure that I go to when it comes to brainstorming ideas is firstly, just talk about principles, secondly, outcomes. When it comes to principles, these things are irrespective of whatever outcomes that you have. So like regardless of any practical outcome that will arise out of a particular mechanism or a policy, why is it absolutely necessary for us to pursue a particular course of action? Why should we do this regardless of outcomes, right? So this can encompass a few things, for instance, like freedom of informed choice, right to access fundamental rights, for instance. So in a debate about, say, allowing for people to sit for a civics examination before they go on elections, for instance, it could be like ensuring that people have informed choice, make sure that people know exactly what is happening within society, within that nation, for instance, fulfilling the obligation of a citizen to know about what is happening within the country right now before they go into elections. So that principle of ensuring that people know what is happening before they go and vote is a principle that you should uphold, and something that you should cater to by implementing a civics examination before people go on to before they are entitled to vote in elections. So those are principles that you would try and think of. You would try to posit within a round and make the judges know that irrespective of what happens in the debate, people should be able to like do something because it's principally justified for us to do so. Or you can also say in a debate about, like, whether or not it's okay for us to sacrifice one person over 5 other people who are like more elderly, for instance. If you're okay with, say, if you're on Gulf bench and you say that you want to protect the elderlies and you don't want to sacrifice, like, a person who is about to die from an explosion, for instance, it's unavoidable, that explosion is unavoidable. You would perhaps say that it's not okay for us to trade any life away. You would say that any institution or any bodies don't have the right to take away life from any other individuals, especially in a scenario where things are unavoidable, where explosions are unavoidable, some tragedies are unavoidable. No one has any right to be able to take the life of other people by measuring life based off of whether or not they're more useful to society, for instance, whether or not they can live longer years, for instance, because life in general is very, very precious. Life is something that is sacred. You should not be taking away life from other people just because you believe other people have more utility towards society. So that is the principle of life that people should uphold at all instances. So if you see what I'm doing here, I'm talking about like principles that people should uphold, and those things I don't touch on outcomes. So why is this really important? I feel like principles, if you're able to show why is it so important that principles ought to be upheld, oftentimes you can just say that regardless of whatever happens, regardless of any outcomes that happen on either side of the house, ultimately those outcomes are speculative. Therefore, what you should therefore prioritize are things like principles, things that like general moral compasses that people would adhere to within society. And why is it that those principles ought to win you guys or win that team the debate? So that's the first part on principles, just talking about certain freedoms and certain rights and fundamental certain fundamentals as human beings that we should be able to access without any agencies interfering whatsoever. The second thing is on outcomes. So obviously that is the preferred, I would say, line of idea that people would resort to within debates. So obviously think about who will be affected by this debate, consider different stakeholders, for instance. And I would also say that before you even think about outcomes, think about the different stakeholders within the debate. So in a motion about this house would abolish examinations, who would the stakeholders be? Obviously, it would be like perhaps the teachers, the students, more importantly, and then perhaps society at large. How is it that society will improve with examinations being abolished, for instance? So once you have like students and then society and then like a smaller actor, teachers, for instance, or lecturers, then that's 3 aspects for you to be able to think about, how is it that all of these impact students? How will society be impacted? How will teachers be impacted? And then you can just branch out even more, to a lot more analysis, as opposed to scrambling, like, what is my first argument? What is my first argument? What is my first argument? I think that is a bit of a, like, it's like, a deer with headlights, you don't know where you're running towards, and that's not strategic. Obviously in a debate, you want to know what you're talking about, you want to know like what ideas you want to run, and you want to have like as much analysis as possible. And I think the way you ensure that you have as much analysis is by firstly identifying the stakeholders, and then talk about how a particular policy will affect these different stakeholders. Obviously, in a debate, there will be multiple stakeholders. It is therefore a question about how you choose the most important stakeholder, prioritizing the actors that are most important and will be most viscerally impacted by a particular policy. So the default motion, this house would abolish examinations if it like there are 3 actors involved: students, society, and the lecturers and teachers, for instance. Obviously, you would prioritize the 2 most important stakeholders, which is firstly the students, because you want to improve the university life of these students. Therefore, you want to ensure that these students are well taken care of. They're able to have make the most out of their university experience, and therefore they should be the most prioritized actor. And then if they are catered to, then therefore that leads to a greater society in a number of aspects. Things like they are more holistic. Students who have different skill sets are able to contribute towards society in a multitude of ways, as opposed to having different specialized, just singular specializations from singular individuals. All of these things, or just society at large benefiting from people having more soft skills, for instance. So I would say that these two are the most important stakeholders in that motion, as opposed to lecturers. Like, sure, you can talk about lecturers and teachers and how perhaps they would teach better, for instance, but maybe slide that under the students' part, like how that still benefits the students, as opposed to having a separate argument on teachers as a whole, right? So there will be different stakeholders that come up within a debate. I think the question, therefore, is what are the most important stakeholders that you should cater to within that debate, right? If you're able to select the most strategic stakeholders and the most important stakeholders, then that is something that would help your team immensely. So yeah, when it comes to brainstorming ideas, just make sure that you have the principles down and you have outcomes down. Just think of what you can run when it comes to principles, and then outcomes. Just first identify the stakeholders and then move on to how this debate affects each of these different stakeholders. So I would always follow this when it comes to brainstorming ideas. Let's talk about principles and outcomes. If you're able to have this in mind, then I'm pretty sure that you will have something to say within a debate round, and you won't feel frantic scrambling and looking for points during prep time, because that's not what you want during prep time. All right, next on analysis. And I would say this is the most important part of an argument. You can flag anything out. You can flag any idea out, but if it's not proven, if you don't show me the analysis, then it is an assertion. An assertion is not persuasive. Like, you can't just say, okay, for instance, in a motion, this house would abolish examinations for university students. You can't just say, students deserve to have fun in university, and that is very, very important. And then you move on to the next argumentation. Obviously, that's not gonna be very persuasive. Like, I don't know why is it that we should care about fun. I don't know why is it that we should care about students having an enjoyable experience. It is through walking us the process analysis and all of the impact analysis on why is it that those things matter to students and to society, that you're able to make the argument persuasive and make the idea persuasive and come across as something that's very compelling. So an idea without analysis and assertion, it's not persuasive. It is an idea with concrete analysis that is an actual argument, which is persuasive. So there are several key components under analysis that I think is the microstructures to an analysis portion of an argument that I think you guys should just take note of when it comes to making arguments. The first component is the premise, briefly explaining what the argument means, which is a bit like the first portion on labeling your argumentation, but you're going a bit in depth already. You're talking about what is it that you're trying to prove with this argument. So for instance, in a motion about this house believes that universities should abolish examinations. And your first argument is how is it that we're able to improve the university experience of these students? So perhaps your premise is by saying that, what do you mean by better university experience? Better university experience perhaps would mean things like perhaps firstly academics, obviously, but also things like extracurricular activities, things like being able to join clubs and societies, like debating, for instance, to learn about soft skills, leadership skills, and just also show a social life for these university students, for them to be able to mingle with their friends and mingle with their peers, have time for family, for instance. All of these things would constitute a university experience for that student. So that is the premise. And if you're under premise, you want to say that by abolishing examinations entirely, you're able to let students have a better university experience. So that is the premise, just explaining what the argument means. Then move on to the logic and process analysis. I think this is the most important bit. Like, thoroughly explaining the logic behind a principle if you're running a principle argumentation, or walking through the steps of how is it that your solution leads to the intended outcomes. So for instance, I'll just talk about the principle first. So in a debate where like there's a classic dilemma that people talk about when it comes to debating. So if you have someone who is, if you have two like train tracks, right, and one person is, you have one young healthy adult who is tied to that first train track A, and you have five elderly senile senior citizens who are tied to track B, and there's an incoming train going full speed, and it is either going to A or B. Presuming the train is going to it's heading towards the direction of train track A, and if you don't pull a trigger, it will still go to train track A and it will kill that young adult. Versus you pull the trigger, you change the train track and have the train be directed at the five elderly senior citizens and kill five of them as opposed to that one young adult. So which one do you choose, right? So if you're a golf bench and you want to say we should not be pulling the trigger, perhaps your argument is you should not be assessing the value of life based off of like whether or not that person is young, whether or not the person is healthy, or whether or not the person is able to contribute to society, because life in general is sacred. We treat every life, every single human being in their life as something that is really precious and something that we should uphold. And you can also extend that to like society in general. How just because people are old and people are sick doesn't mean that we just abandon them. Doesn't mean that this doesn't mean that states just abandon them and let them die. States have welfare systems. States engage in any sort of philanthropy effort to ensure that senior citizens are taken care of. Things in the form of homes for the elderly, senior citizens in general, subsidies for elderlies when they go to hospitals and have treatments, for instance. So all of these things are in line with the principle that we should value every single life, and we should not be assessing life as to who is more important than the other and all that stuff. Therefore, you would not be pulling the trigger and like changing the train tracks, for instance. So what I'm doing here is explain very thoroughly the principle behind the sacredness of life and why is it so important that we should uphold life irrespective of age, health, and all of these things, right? So if you're able to thoroughly explain all of these things to show why is it that principle is so important and something that society already upholds within society, then you're able to show the judge that this is something that we should follow through and we should not be abandoning this principle of sacrificing life for other utility measures, because utility or the effectiveness of a particular decision doesn't matter if it means that you're making arbitrations between who is more important when it comes to life, right? So that is the principle. When it comes to outcomes, I think it's a bit more straightforward. So firstly, talk about the situation at hand. What does it look like right now? How will the situation be resolved once you implement a particular action? And therefore, how does that affect the multiple stakeholders within a debate, and then the likely outcomes? So the default motion, this helps with abolish examinations. If you're talking about students and improving their university life, we can perhaps start off by saying that firstly, students are incredibly pressurized to keep up their grades. So once you're able to abolish examinations, you're able to do away with grades, do away with competition and pressure. How does that affect the stakeholders? That's where you go into how will students be better off? So for instance, they don't have to cram studies, they don't have to cram burn a midnight oil and study so much just for an arbitrary A+ grade for the examinations. You would instead have them go towards more like practical forms of assessments, things like working on projects, working in community service, or having them engage in more society-based or club activities, for instance. Perhaps that would likely lead to them having outcomes such as acquiring more comprehensive skill sets, debating, speaking, leadership skills, or even like athletics, for instance, improving on their health, just venturing into different possibilities, because now they have the time to do so, because they don't have to study for examinations night and day, right? So just walk through the process as to how is it that students will get better, how is it that students will be impacted, and what are the outcomes that come as a result. So yeah, premise, explaining what the argument means very generally, and then walk me through very robustly the logic and the process analysis behind the premise and that particular idea and argument. So that's the first two parts. Next would be evidence. I think one of the rookie mistakes when it comes to debating is that I think people often say an idea and then they move on to say examples like, oh, we should do this because like just look at I forgot what country is it, Finland. Like Finland has abolished examinations for their students and they're healthier and happier now, I think evidence should not be the main part of the argument. They should come after your process analysis and your logic analysis. So presumably your argument is talking about how students are able to have a happier life and have a more holistic learning experience in universities. After walking through all of the process, like things like, they have more time now, they have less pressure, they can pursue different things to learn about themselves and discover themselves. All of those things will obviously lead to them feeling happier and more fulfilled. And then you bring on the example of Finland and how the students there don't have examinations, they have alternative assessment methods, and they prioritize things like community services, club activities, other projects, for instance. All of these things are evidence to back up your process analysis to show why is it that the outcomes are likely to be true, right? So don't make examples and evidence as the core part of the arguments, because I feel like a lot of rookie debaters tend to do that. Provide examples and past occurrences or similar cases wherever it's necessary to show how is it that this principle is important, or how the outcome is likely to be true, or how is it that it has already happened in other countries, therefore this means that it is likely to happen also under your will with a particular policy and emotion. That is evidence done. The final thing is with regards to relevance and impact. And I would say this is the second most important part of any argument. So you can't just say a bunch of things without telling me why is it that I should care? Why is it that I should care about students having a better university experience, right? I think you need to be able to show why is it that argument matters so much in a larger context. So it could be perhaps it is very important for students to have an enjoyable university experience, because firstly, university is expensive. You want to ensure that because they paid so much money to go into universities, that they learn the most out of their time in university. And learning the most isn't just through reading books and sitting for examinations, it's through other things as well, social skills, leadership skills, etc., etc. It could also be because you want them to be able to have this great experience for them that they can translate into actual society later on when they're dealing with actual society. So like people always say that university is like a mini society. Therefore, if you're able to ensure that these students have the necessary skill sets to be able to endure mini society, then they'll be able to transition well into the actual society in the working world, as opposed to status quo, where these students just study. You don't prepare them for like actual skills and potential real life drama that will happen within society. You don't prepare them for that. You just let them cram books into their brains and then just shove them off to society. And that's not right, right? So all of these things necessarily mean that if you're able to show the relevance of your argument and show why is it so impactful for us to prioritize the argument or the stakeholder, then obviously the judges will feel like, oh wow, okay, this is actually very important. We should be doing this because it matters to the students and also matters to society later on, right? So just tell the judges why a particular argument is so important, why you should prioritize that argument over potentially anything that your opponents will run, right? When it comes to like things like having better grades, for instance. So presumably in Gulf world, if you want to abolish examinations and opposition wants to maintain examinations, opposition might say, oh, knowledge is very important. Like having good grades is very important because it ensures that you have a specialization, ensures that people have knowledge and society in general. Just say that your argument matters more because firstly, knowledge and specialization often doesn't translate to real life success. Oftentimes you need other things like social skills, soft skills, leadership skills, the ability to communicate well and speak well. All of these things are also far more important. It can also point to a trend where these things are far more prioritized by job interviews within society to ensure that these are well-rounded individuals that can be assets to the companies and for society in general. So just explicitly talk about the relevance and impact of your argument and why is it that they are more important than supposedly what all the other teams will say within a debate. So just to recap, premise, which is the just briefly explaining what the argument means, and then the logic, the process analysis, show us the principle walkthrough as to why is it that we should care about something, and then in an outcome argumentation, just talk about the outcomes. How is it that you want to solve something? How will stakeholders be affected? What are the outcomes? How will stakeholders be affected as a result? Maybe some evidence that would help to show that something that is in line with trends, in line with status quo trajectory, why these things will happen, and then talk about the relevance and the impact of all of these argumentations. So premise, process analysis, evidence, relevance, and impact. And then the final part would be to summarize your arguments in 1 or 2 sentences. I would say this is also really important because you want to be able to put a definitive full stop at the end of your argument so that the judges know, okay, this is a very solid argument, we have to prioritize this. You can conclude and summarize your arguments in a number of ways. Firstly, after you've summarized using 1 or 2 sentences, just be very quick with the summary, maybe ground your arguments further. And there are a few ways to ground arguments, right? So for instance, you can either compare both worlds. And the way people do this is just say, okay, in governance world, once you abolish examinations, students have the ability to pursue whatever they want and become more well-rounded individuals. In opposition's world, students are only book smart, but they're not real life smart, right? And obviously that's bad, you can also talk about a worst case scenario. So for instance, under your world, even if the students flunk their results, even if the students don't end up having great specializations, they don't have great knowledge, that's still fine because they're comparatively more well-rounded and people care about more like well-rounded individuals as opposed to grades and A pluses on a piece of examination slip, for instance. So comparing both worlds, illustrating why your worst case scenario is better than the opposition's best case scenario. We can even trade off, like perhaps say you would trade off these students becoming like Albert Einstein. You would trade off having the next Albert Einstein or the next Thomas Edison, for instance. You would trade all of these things off in favor of individuals who are more well-rounded, individuals who have like different skill sets, for instance, become better assets to society. So you can make trade-offs. You can also use emotive appeal, play with the emotions of the judges. So talk about, like, if it's a debate about life, about sacrificing one young adult or sacrificing 5 elderly senior citizens, you can just say, life in general is really, really important. It's really valuable. You cannot make arbitrations between different lives, and you have to prioritize every single life. It's unfortunate that we have to, like, someone has to die, but because this, like, life in general is so important, you should not be choosing one over the other. You would just let the train just run through that young adult and kill that one adult, as opposed to being morally complicit in killing off like 5 senior citizens and being complicit in undermining the value of life in general. Just play to the emotions of the judges and show them that this is something that they should absolutely consider when it comes to assessing your arguments in the debate, right? So this is like the summary of the argumentation structure that I think teams can always, sorry, water. Teams to just follow this structure in general. So I can take a picture if you want. Idea analysis and then conclude your argument. Like I said just now, for the idea portion, just label the argument, signpost, my first argument is what, and then when you're about to go to your second argument, my second argument, just making sure that everything is very clear cut, and then label the argument, explaining the essence of the argument, and then move on to the process analysis, logic analysis, status quo, outcomes, impacts, principles, evidence, talk about the relevance and importance, why is it that we should care about this, and then conclude by summarizing and then grounding through trade-offs, comparisons, and emotions. All right, so I think that is the second portion done. Before we move on to like trying out a debate motion, I think there was a question just now. It says, should we leave pointing out who's the most important to whip and reply speeches or second speakers? Oh, like clash analysis. Clash analysis is oftentimes done in the whip speeches. So whip is like the third speaker in a 3 versus 3 debate. Or if it's a BP debate where there's 2 versus 2 versus 2 versus 2, then the very last speaker from every single team would be the whip speaker. Clash analysis, you leave that for whip speeches, but pointing out the most important stakeholders, I think any speaker can do it. Any speaker can say that this is the most important argument, this is the most important stakeholder we should prioritize, and then just talk about why is it we should prioritize. You don't have to leave everything to the whip speaker, as long as you're able to show, why is it that a particular stakeholder should be prioritized, then, and if it helps your case in general, then by all means just go ahead. You don't have to leave everything to like the whip speaker and the reply speeches. Like second speakers are obligated to extend, and extensions don't always mean like new arguments. It can also be doing the necessary trade-offs, the necessary like prioritization of stakeholders. All of these things can happen within the second speaker as well. Doesn't have to be the whip speeches entirely. All right, I hope that answers your question. Maybe we're just gonna do like a debate motion right now. I'm going to share my screen so we can see this Google Doc. All right, give me a second, sorry. Okay, I hope you guys can see this. Yeah, so this was one of the motions that we had in UADC yesterday. As a parent from a minority community, this house would teach your children to pursue a mediocre but satisfactory, happy life over a life which involves a constant pursuit of excellence and the extraordinary. The reason why I chose this is because I feel like, presumably a lot of us here are Asians. We've been victims of tiger parenting at some point. So I personally relate to this very, very well. And I think a lot of you guys can. So perhaps let's just work on this motion. Right, if you're arguing as a government, obviously you would be in favor of teaching the children to pursue a mediocre but satisfactory, happy life over excellence, becoming like the best of the best, for instance. So as usual, when it comes to prep time, don't just scramble for arguments immediately. Just talk about things like status quo, things like problems that are happening with status quo. How would you go about implementing this? How would this what are the teachings of the parents in general? Your stance. What is your stance? And then only you move on to argumentation, right? So just intuitively, perhaps status quo could be things like you can first talk about minority communities, the kinds of struggles that they face, things like racism, structural barriers. Sorry, typo. They're hard to be integrated. Perhaps they face difficulties in securing jobs or promotions, all of these things, right? And then you can also perhaps say that in status quo, minority communities are like, especially Asian, you can also point to like how Asian Americans, for instance, prone to tiger parenting, And then I can also talk about always pressuring kids to do a lot of things, piano lessons, tuition, excelling in exams, for instance. So all of these things are status quo, right? So for instance, just talk about these things and then just talk about the problems. Perhaps just say that this is a question about whether or not minority communities in which world will minority communities be happier? Or rather, will children from minority communities be happier? Right? Because presumably right now this is a question between should you teach your child to just be happy with what they have or who they are, or would you want them to constantly strive for more in life and be the best of the best, right? So yeah, I think just like I said, just talk about status quo and then some of the problems that arise from status quo, things like perhaps massive pressure on kids to do well, for instance. Or you can also talk about, say, there's status quo about how African Americans, their families are subjected to stereotypes, that their kids are bad, never going to be successful, which then leads to a second problem, which is perhaps that other communities face like stereotyping, etc., etc. So the question, therefore, in this debate is perhaps you believe that in a world with structural racism that is hard to be overcome, you want the kids to be happy. And that is the most important thing, right? Compared to success and being extraordinary, right? Perhaps that is your stance. And then perhaps you move on to mechanization. How is it that if you are a parent from a minority community, how would you teach their children to pursue a mediocre and satisfactory but happy life? So how would you teach your children to do these things? Perhaps you would say that as a parent, you would teach the child maybe to prioritize their interests, prioritize family values, cultural values, hobbies, etc. And then you would not pressure the kid to do amazing in school, do a bunch of different things, just prioritize their interests, etc. So I think at this point, you can also maybe think about opposition would say. Opposition might accuse you of, letting that child starve when they become adults because you have forsaken their education, for instance. They will accuse you of becoming like a bad parent, for instance, because you did not prioritize your education. You let them, work like really bad jobs like janitors, for instance. Not to say a janitor is a bad job, absolutely not. But like just bad in the eyes of society in general. So you can also preempt that by saying that because this debate already says mediocre but satisfactory happy life, mediocre doesn't mean bad jobs like janitor, etc. Obviously the parent would ensure the kid has the basic qualifications to work in a decent job, be like an office clerk or whatever, a waiter, etc. So to ensure that they don't starve, right? So I think you can also talk about this within your within your setup, the mechanization, right? So you see, if you're able to talk about all of these things within the first 2 to 3 minutes within prep, then that is a very good foundation for you to there's a very good foundation for people to be able to make compelling arguments based off all of these problems and all of these status quo to begin with, right? So perhaps your first argumentation would be why is it that you want to teach their children to be more to pursue happiness over success, right? So you can just talk about how happiness is more important than success, right? So there are a few layers to this. Perhaps you can say like success is hard to achieve, or happiness is more definite, less dependent on society, right? So I think we can just do 2 layers for now. Obviously, success is hard to achieve. Maybe you can say, so this is the labeling, and then this is like the idea and the premise. Then maybe here, this is where you talk about like a lot of the process analysis that I talked about just now, regards to like what are some of the problems that you see with racism right now with kids and from minority communities in general. I can perhaps just say like firstly, these kids are subjected to a lot of racism, social barriers that that prevent them from achieving success. You can also say that kids from minority always have to go the extra mile, put in extra efforts, but even then success is not guaranteed because of all of the social barriers that you guys can talk about with regards to like job interviewers favoring a certain race, for instance. In Malaysia, for instance, it will be perhaps an issue of like the Bumiputra rights, for instance, how the Chinese would often be deprioritized in a lot of job sectors, like government job sectors, for instance. So like these are problems that you can talk about with regards to why success is hard to achieve, right? And therefore, it is like this would perhaps likely mean that this means that you can pour in success as much as you want and still not succeed, which means obviously if you try so hard and you still don't succeed, the kid will end up being miserable, right? Maybe the second layer is like happiness is more definite. Maybe like when it comes to this being less dependent on society, you can talk about things like for instance, in a world where the kid prioritizes self and family values, then success isn't as important to the child. Obviously, like able to derive happiness from other facets of life as opposed to just achievements. And then because you don't prioritize success, you prioritize yourself and your well-being. Therefore, you are also less prone to being hurt by societal judgments because you find meaning within yourself and your community, for instance, right? Yeah, you can also say, I think on like perhaps when it comes to success being hard to achieve, you can also say even if the kid achieves success, because you're always told to strive for a lot more, to be extraordinary, this would perhaps mean that like you're always comparing yourself to other people, you always want to strive for more, which means that you're never going to be satisfied. You're always going to be comparing yourself to like the billionaires and the Elon Musks, for instance. So you will always be comparing yourself against others, and you're never gonna be happy. So all of these necessarily mean that under Gov World, the children not only lead a happier life during childhood, but also in the future as an adult, right? Maybe you can also add on to like happier life during childhood. You can also say that because you are told to strive for extraordinary success, this will also mean that during childhood, this means doing a lot of things for achievement's sake and never prioritizing your interests, hobbies, makes childhood very dry, right? So like all of these things are just problems that pertain to success being hard to achieve. And even if you do achieve it, the kid is likely to be very unhappy because you've forsaken the childhood and you make them always compare against other people. And how under your world with the families teaching the kids to be more like find more meaning within themselves and be less dependent on societal judgments and less dependent on societal expectations on you, then obviously you're able to derive better happiness from like your immediate communities, your family members, your friends, for instance. So obviously your world is better, right? In the future as a result. So maybe just ground your arguments by saying that and this is where you make the comparison, even if oppositions will, for the child, despite the child will never grow to appreciate it because of the constant comparison and over happiness. On Gov World, the kids are happy. That's definite and more valuable. So if you see what I'm doing here, during prep, you just talk about all of these things. Obviously, you don't have to spell everything out so fully. I'm just doing this because I want to make sure you guys understand the rationale behind all of these statements that I'm making here. But obviously during prep time, you have to use shorter terms, shorter words, for instance, these things. And then you're able to make more holistic argumentations here and then comparisons here from like your labeling to your premises, all of your analysis, different layers, and then moving on to the grounding. You compare the worst case to the best case, right? Right. So maybe I'll share this later in the WhatsApp group that we have for reference, but this is basically how you go about structuring argumentations. If you're able to follow this from the very get-go, then you guys will be able to have a very good base to have good argumentations later on. Okay. I'm gonna answer some questions now. Yeah, we have a question here. I have a question. Why are debate points usually very US-centric, like this one? Does it have to be so? No, you don't have to, like, like absolutely debates don't have to be US centric. This is just an example that I had. So in America, for instance, you have different minority communities like Asian Americans and African Americans, for instance. They absolutely don't have to be like US centric. Your examples don't have to be US centric. It's just that if you're able to illustrate the most compelling examples, I think, or show examples that people immediately have access to, then you're able to just make a more compelling statement, a more compelling illustration towards the judges. And yeah, how do you take down principal argumentations? In a different way, there are different ways to take down principal argumentations. You can firstly just well, maybe there will be a clash of principle. So under your world, in the motion just now with regards to like killing off one young adult versus killing off 5 senior citizens, presumably Gulf world that is okay with killing off that one life is saying that it is okay for us to kill off that one life because that was unavoidable, and you don't want to make arbitrations between which life is more important. Opposition's world perhaps is a clash. They would clash by saying that in terms of principle of life, you would prioritize utility, especially since these 5 adult senior citizens have already lived their life towards being 70 years old. Compare that to the young adult that has perhaps only lived for 25 years. And because these 5 senior citizens have already had the chance to live their life to the fullest extent, therefore, you should let that one young adult have the chance to explore, have the same chance that these senior citizens already have in order to become, have the full human experience, right? So these are 2 different argumentations. It literally boils down to how you are able to weigh each other off. It's very, very hard to do it here. Like in an actual debate, perhaps it'll be easier to illustrate, but just illustrating clashing principles and talk about why is it that your principle matters more, why the principle of life matters more than living the best life, for instance. So either you do that, or you can just talk about how outcomes are more important. Like you don't care if the principle of life is upheld, if it means that you lose out on that ability of the one individual to contribute to society compared to the 5 senior citizens who are going to pass away anyway, then presumably that is a outcome and a utility that you should be able to prioritize on that front. Since there's no set way to do it, but obviously you should be weighing between different principles, or weighing between principles and outcomes, and telling the judge why is it that we should prioritize one over the other. All right. I will share this later in the WhatsApp group. If you have any questions, just let me know. In the meantime, let's just head back to the slides so we can start the final portion of this workshop. Okay, I hope you guys can see this. I will continue. Right, rebuttals, responses to rebuttals. It's pronounced rebuttal. It's basically saying or proving that a statement is false, right? So there are a lot of rebuttals that will happen in the debate round because you need to show the judge not just that you are right, but the opposition is wrong, or the opposition is less important. And I think there are a few common mistakes that comes with doing rebuttals. Like firstly, the first common mistake that I observe with novice debaters is that they don't actually rebut something. Like say for instance, you guys in a motion where this house would abolish examinations, if opposition comes up and say grades are very, very important, therefore we should not be you should not be abolishing examinations. The rookie mistake is to just say that grades are not it's just saying that opposition is wrong, grades are not important, and you immediately just go back to your own points. Oh, but soft skills are also very important. Leadership skills are also very important. So essentially, you're just immediately reverting back to your own points, but you're not actually explaining how is it that something is not true. You're not actually saying why is it opposition's points are false, but also even if they're true, why is it that they're less important, right? So don't just say something is not that isn't true, but not explaining how, but just be more holistic and be more robust in telling the judge why is it that grades are not that important. It could be along the lines of like perhaps grades are not that important because they are not reflective of you as a character, as a person as a whole. And secondly, grades are perhaps arbitrary. It differs according to different subjects in different universities. So how is it that you can use grades as a basis of comparison and a metric of assessing how good an individual is, right? So that is actually how you show that grades being important is something that is false, right? The second rookie mistake is teams would unsuccessfully show that the argument is false. Like I think, say for instance, if a team comes up and says like grades are very, very important, you would spend, I feel like some teams would be tricked into spending 2 to 3 minutes trying to show why the argument is false, without like, actually dealing with your own points and your own argumentations, which essentially means that you'll be wasting time in that front. And also, thirdly, I feel like people tend to just attack examples as opposed to attacking the actual lines of analysis. So, for instance, in a debate about like abolishing examinations, if opposition says, "Oh, grades are very important," like you see, for instance, people with 7 A's in UPSR go to great high schools. People with good CGPA, they go further their masters overseas and stuff like that, right? But those are just examples, and you should not be attacking examples. You should not say that, oh, but there are certain 7A UPSR students that don't end up going to good schools, or like, there are certain people with good CGPA that don't get scholarships, for instance, they don't get to go to good universities, right? Those are just attacking examples. You're not actually rebutting, you're not actually attacking the core of the opposition's argumentation. I think the most effective rebuttals attack the core of the argumentation. You attack the analysis. You don't attack the examples. That is just not strategic, right? So I think these are the three things that most novice debaters often do, which I don't think are very strategic. I think you have to be able to show, firstly, why the analysis is problematic, why it's illogical, or sometimes you just can't disprove a certain statement, right? Because how are you to disprove that life is important? You can't say that, oh, life is not. So you rebut not by saying that the opposition's points are perhaps not important, but saying that your point is more important on that front, right? So these are common mistakes with rebuttals. Try not to do this. And I have some methods to recommend to you guys as to how to rebut. So firstly, bring up the facts, bring up what you've already said from the very beginning, point out the flaws within the opposition's case. And I don't mean just attacking examples, but thirdly, if you can use the rebuttal to your advantage and show that how you can either do it better under your will, under government, for instance, then that is the best form of rebuttal, right? So some strategic responses that teams can try and prioritize when responding to other people's argumentations, right? So firstly, attack the premise and line of reasoning, not the examples. Don't just say that, oh, it's false that grades don't get you into good universities, for instance, or grades don't get you good jobs because look at my friend or my cousin, for instance. That's just not strategic. You should be talking about why is it that grades are not that important. Perhaps job interviewers don't value grades that much anymore. They value things like soft skills a bit more compared to grades these days. You look at a lot of these examples in society of like, how supposedly someone has done well in school, but they can't seem to secure a job because they're failing the job interviews, for instance, right? So that's attacking the premise and the line of reasoning. The second thing is mitigate the outcomes, either benefits or harms that opposition talks about. So presumably, if like in a motion where this house would abolish examinations and opposition says that if you're able to secure great results, excellent grades in examinations, then you're able to place yourself at a higher social standing to get better jobs in the future, right? It can point out to firstly some hindrances to the benefits, right? So like I said just now, just talk about how job interviewers look at interviewees these days. What kind of factors do they prioritize? They don't just prioritize grades anymore, but also because opposition's world is hell bent on students getting good grades, it also means that they sacrifice soft skills, they sacrifice their leadership skills and speaking skills, for instance. How all of these things naturally means that the students are less well-rounded, which means that the students don't actually get selected for certain jobs, for instance. So just explain the hindrances to the benefits that opposition talks about, right? Mechanisms to deal with the harms and negative outcomes. So opposition might accuse you of saying that, if you don't have examinations, then these people will obviously become like stupid. They're going to fail their examinations and society is going to suffer as a result. Firstly, you can just point out as Gulf that obviously these students are not going to fail because you have alternative assessment methods, like having them engage in group community work, group projects, for instance, get them to involve themselves in society, clubs and societies in general, so that you ensure that firstly, they're not going to be horrible individuals that fail their that don't learn anything in university. But more importantly, because you have these things in place, you get better forms of learning from these students. You get them to internalize knowledge better, have real life practical experiences. All of these things are better than the kind of negative things that they say in regards to how these students don't have knowledge or don't have experience and all of these things, because you get that under Gov's world with our alternative assessment methods as well. The third thing is to acknowledge the argument of opposition, but talk about why they are less important than yours, right? You can do this via number, via scale, or via principle, right? So in the debate just now, or rather the explanation just now, when it comes to like choosing whether or not you want to kill off one young adult or kill off 5 senior citizens, right? If opposition says that we should prioritize utility, we should prioritize the ability for the young adult to contribute to society, right? I think you can also rebut that by saying that, well, it is true that the young adult would contribute to society. There are other things that are more important than the young adult's contribution. And perhaps it is the way we view life in general, the way we view senior citizens or disenfranchised communities in general, right? So if you say it is okay for us to kill off 5 senior citizens, that naturally means that all elderlies, the life of the elderlies would be less important than young adults, which means that this reduces incentive for states to want to pump into like welfare, for instance, healthcare systems to cater to the elderlies, which naturally means that you are likely going to lead to a lot more elderlies get disenfranchised and get disadvantaged, because under opposition's world, you have made that decision to say that the life of a young adult is more valuable, for instance, right? So you don't want to do that. You just want to say that life is valuable across the board. There is no like who is more valuable, who is less valuable, for instance. I think if you're able to just use these use principal argumentations and also just weighing numbers and scales, for instance, then that would be a very good way of rebutting the opposition's arguments, right? Because in the argument just now, the opposition was just talking about how that one young adult will contribute to society, right? So you make that one young adult less important by talking about how it's not just the 5 senior citizens, it's the entire senior citizen community that will be disprivileged and will be harmed under opposition's role, where they feel as though their life is just not valuable as a whole, and states have an incentive to reduce healthcare for these elderlies and make them suffer as a result, which is not a good society. It's not what the state should do. The state should be able to help everyone irrespective of their age, right? So just remember, these are the strategic responses and rebuttals that you guys should be having. Attack the premise and line of reasoning, mitigate outcomes, but also if you're not able to disprove the argument, which happens very frequently, just talk about why is it that their argumentation matters less, and why is it that your material is more important than the opposing house's argumentations, right? Okay, so Q&A. Any questions? I think we're coming to the end of my session. If you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourselves or just type it out in chat for me. I'll try and answer anything here before I close off. Can arguments be responsive? Absolutely. So I think like arguments definitely, so you don't have to respond through rebuttals only. I think by making arguments that directly clash with what the opposition is trying to say, then that is also a response to your opposition. So presumably on the principle of like value of life, if Gulf World is saying that life is equal all across the board, life is valuable all across the board, we should not be making arbitrations, and opposition is saying that actually, yeah, sure, life is important, but in a scenario where like death is going to happen anyway on either side, you're better off ensuring that you're able to derive the most out of those deaths. And the way you do that is by ensuring that the one young adult continues to live, so that the young adult is able to contribute to society in general, right? So like that is also a response to the principal argumentation from the Gulf World, just that they're just made in the form of an argumentation, right? So just in short, arguments can be responsive. You don't have to just do it via rebuttals, but obviously this will require you to really clash against what the Gulf World is trying to say, what your opponents are trying to say on that front. I hope that answers your question. Can we access the recording? Yes, I believe TJ will upload this to the Walls YouTube channel later, I think. Yeah, I think they will. All right. But yeah, I think I'll just maybe ramble a bit, like 1 or 2 minutes, just to let everyone type out their questions and everything, if they have any. But yeah, this is just like the first series, sorry, the first lecture or the first workshop in a series of workshops that we'll be having leading up to Malaysian Nationals. We have 4 amazing EdgeCom members for Nationals this year. There's myself, there's TJ, there's Hannah, and then there's Zazu from Mara. And we'll be conducting lectures on a variety of topics. Like today, I'm talking about like the basic stuff with regards to argumentations, structure. And then tomorrow, I don't know who's doing tomorrow. I think it's Hannah. They'll be doing a different topic. But we'll also be doing like more topic centralized workshops. So I'll be doing minorities later during the month. And then there are other workshops on like China, for instance, technology, for instance, the economy. So I think those things are also helpful for you to build up like your knowledge base for future debate rounds in general. Yeah. So yeah, I think if you have any other questions, feel free to text me in the WhatsApp group. I'm happy to answer any questions. Other than that, I want to thank everyone for being so attentive. I hope you guys learned a thing or two from this workshop, just basic structures for argumentations. And yeah, I hope to see you guys in the next workshop and hopefully in Malaysian Nationals as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ernest, for the amazing and insightful workshop. So this workshop is recorded and will be posted on YouTube. Once the recording is up, I think I'll create an entire playlist and share it with all of you. So once again, thank you everyone for coming to participate in this workshop. I hope that you find it helpful. I definitely found it quite interesting myself. And if you like this session, we have 9 more sessions coming up. Tomorrow, Hannah is giving a workshop. I am going to be doing a workshop on artificial intelligence as well. So if you're interested, you can sign up for that. Okay,